Loved by wine critics, but a stranger to broad commercial appeal, Riesling is a light-skinned aromatic grape of German origin, which is also responsible for some of Germany's greatest and longest-lived wines. Riesling is made in a range of styles. Although widely associated with the wines of the Mosel and Alsace, Riesling is planted all over the world and has established itself in the likes of Washington and Australia Clare Valley. With today's guest, we discussed the conundrum of this Riesling. Dr. John Haeger is the author of the book Riesling Rediscovered, Bold, Bright and Dry. Riesling comes in many shapes and forms, and each market has its own preferences to the style that is most enjoyed. With Dr. Haeger, we speak about the key markets of Riesling and the regions that Riesling is grown at. We then discuss the factors that come to play to the early showing of petrol in the development of Riesling, and I question if the German system of must wait is still relevant today, on a warming climate, and much more. If you're enjoying the podcast, remember to hit the subscribe button and to press follow to know when the next episode have been released. Hi, I'm Mattias Carpazza, and this is the Looking Into Wine podcast. Wine and winemaking can be complex, but this podcast has a simple mission. We want to give you the skills and tools to harness your passion about wine. Through this series, we will shine a spotlight on some of the different regions, process, and concepts that shape the fascinating world of wine. I hope you enjoy the show and your own journey looking into wine. Hello, and welcome to the Looking Into Wine podcast, talking all things wine. Today's guest is the author of the book Riesling Rediscovered, Bold, Bright and Dry. His articles have appeared in The Connoisseur, Wine and Spirit, and in Japan, Wine's Kingdom. I welcome to the Looking Into Wine podcast, Dr. John Haeger. Welcome to the show.
Thank you, Matteo.
It's a pleasure to have you here, and you wrote a few books first on Pinot Noir, and then you wrote this book on Riesling. What was the inspiration moving from Pinot Noir to Riesling? Why Riesling?
Yeah, so it's a perfectly reasonable question, and I have to say that the answer is maybe surprising. I was certainly aware of Riesling. I wasn't a huge Riesling drinker. I wasn't already knowledgeable about Riesling. I was really looking for a white variety to treat the same way I had treated Pinot Noir in the first two books, which was a huge learning experience for me. And I think that writing books usually is a learning experience. I think you spend a lot of time doing research. You spend a lot of time solving problems and trying to locate sources and trying to separate good information from not so good information. That really only comes with a long period of attention. I suppose I could have done Chardonnay, but I'm not a huge fan of Chardonnay, and everybody's written about Chardonnay anyway. There hadn't been a book specifically about Riesling for a considerable length of time. Stuart Pickett's first book, back from the 1980s, was still in print, but that was the most recent thing, and it was out of date. So I thought, well, maybe that's a good time to do something about Riesling.
Perfect. I mean, it sounds perfectly reasonable, and Riesling is really one of the main grape varieties, white grape varieties around the world. And I was really excited when I saw the book, and I've read it already a couple of times before during my studies, and now again. It's very interesting. It's such an exciting grape variety. It's one of my favorite. But one of the things that you speak in your books is about the predicament of Riesling, and what is it? Why does it have this predicament?
It's maybe not the most auspicious way to talk about a first chapter in a book, but I actually was concerned by a lot of the circumstances of Riesling that I saw when I began to do the research, visiting in some cases areas that I had not spent very much time in before. So let's kind of unpack this a little bit. So let's say we're circa 2000, the beginning of the 21st century. It seems to me that Riesling moves into that 21st century with more stylistic baggage than any other major white wine grape variety. What is it? How does it get characterized? How do you describe it? What are the words that surround it? All of that is problematic really from day one. Let's look at Germany first, because Germany is, of course, the largest producer of Riesling in the world. In the beginning of the 21st century, German Riesling was overwhelmingly dry. 75% of it was dry, and it was assumed dry, presumed dry, and liked dry by the German wine consumer, the post-war consumer, particularly the second generation post-war, the people who were born in the 1960s and 70s, had a very strong affinity for dry wines. So in Germany, it's a modern consumer. It's a very cosmopolitan consumer. People don't really realize this, but Germany is either the second or the third largest wine import country in the world. Depending on how you count, it's either second or third. The German consumer is very knowledgeable about almost every other European wine. Now, at the same time, we have the second largest wine producing, Riesling producing country in the world is the United States. And the situation is almost the polar opposite. In the United States, 80% of the wine is sweet in some degree, and you have to look hard to find the dry wines. The consumer is also totally different. The consumer of sweet Riesling, but it also happens to be sweet, doesn't live in any of the major wine markets. These are not people from New York. They are not people from Washington, D.C. They are not people even from Florida and Texas, which are also giant wine markets in this country. They're really from the Pacific Northwest, and they're from the middle of the country, both the Mountain West and the Plains states. And they have very different tastes. They love sweet wine. In fact, they don't drink Chardonnay so it's a completely different consumer base is attracted to this wine and sustains a sweetish product as the mainstay of the American Riesling market. You go from there to Australia, which is the next largest producer. You're looking at, again, an almost completely dry tradition. Although it isn't really a dry tradition, it's just a dry present. Then if you go back to Alsace, which of course was in many parts of the last 300 years part of Germany rather than being part of France, Alsace prides itself on being all dry wines, but they're not really being honest because, in fact, those wines are not all dry. They are off-dry in many cases. And indeed, some of the most expensive ones are off-dry because somebody had to do something when the first Grand Cru wines were enabled in the 1970s to make it stand out. So they left more sugar in and they made it into a bigger, interesting wine, they thought. So it's interprofessional organization that is responsible for promoting Alsace wines will say that Alsace wines are all dry. They aren't quite. So it's a fairly complicated picture. Then we have the Austrians. Well, everybody thinks about Austria as some kind of appendage of Germany, which couldn't be less true. The Austrians will tell you, here it is true that if it has an Austrian capsule on it, if it's that red and white stripe, dry. It is almost certainly dry. You don't have to worry about it. It's dry. That's true, but there isn't very much of it. Actually, Austria is a tiny producer of Riesling. It's way down the list in terms of countries that have any stake in Riesling. There's vastly more Riesling in places like the Ukraine than there is in Austria. So no matter how wonderful it is, and a lot of it is really wonderful, it doesn't show up.
And how does this Riesling is shows in many countries, and you mentioned Ukraine and being in Austria. Why is, from the viticultural standpoint, why do they want to have Riesling? What is the quality to have Riesling?
So I think there's a different story in almost every case. Well, the Austrians did it because they were actually suppliers to Germany. When they were suppliers to Germany, they were actually not making dry Riesling. They were making some adulterated Swedish Riesling. And that was a huge scandal in the 1980s. Reinvented itself. It became something that it had not been before. It was quality oriented. It was no longer primarily a supplier to Germany, although Germany remains a large customer for Austrian wines today. Ukraine, I have absolutely no idea. We're going to have to find a Ukrainian to answer that question. I have no idea. There was a lot of Riesling planted in several Eastern European countries just in the last 2 decades. I don't know why that became so popular so quickly. So we have to find somebody who knows more than I do.
But why is what are the traits or the qualities of having generally planting Riesling compared to other grape varieties? Has it got any particular more benefit? Why would you want to plant Riesling?
Well, if it were happening today rather than in 2000 or 2010, you could say that a lot of the attraction to Riesling now, but it's mostly experimental, is that Riesling seems the perfect poster child for a white wine variety that is living on a warming planet. So that's very fundamental, because all over the world, in established wine regions and in aspiring wine regions, the question is, how much longer are we going to be able to grow Syrah that tastes the way we want it to grow at this latitude and with this climate and with much earlier harvests every year. Harvests in Alsace of all varieties, not just Riesling, have moved almost 30 days earlier since the 1970s. The average harvest start date was well into October for many of these varieties in 1970s. And now we're closer to the beginning of September. It's just a major, major change in climate. And people are worried. Will they have to treat it differently? Will they have to do different kinds of trellising? Will they have to do modifications? Do they need to look for clonal selections that are better adapted to some of these things? And I think Riesling is a very interesting one because it's very tough. Schultz, the president of Geisenheim University and the most important research center that concentrates on Riesling in the world, likens it to a donkey. He says it just keeps on going. It's a very resistant to most things. You can plant it where there's virtually no soil. It can be planted practically in rock. So it's great for dry farming. We're going to have to do more dry farming because we don't have enough available water to do irrigation in many of the places that have been irrigated from the beginning and others that have become irrigated recently. Austria now is almost all wine regions in Austria are being irrigated. And that was not true 10 years ago. In fact, there were laws against it, but those laws have disappeared. So I think a variety that is high in acid, retains acid at the end of the growing season, that ripens late, a counterbalance to the warmer weather, and one that's reasonably disease resistant is really a perfect variety. It is sort of, if you were a grape breeder and somebody brought you a contract that said, create a new crossing for us, create a new variety that's white, that will do all of these things, you'd have to say, it's already there. I can't do anything any better than Riesling. So it's perfect.
And one thing with Riesling, I mean, you can see, as you mentioned earlier, like Germany, USA, and Australia, they have completely quite different climates, and yet they're still producing Riesling. But then the one thing about Riesling is really you can smell it and you can see it's different from different part of the countries. And for me, it's fascinating because you can have this like almost pure German Riesling to compare to the Australian that tends to be a bit more broader and richer, but the petrol-like flavors that tends to be showing up a bit earlier in Austria, in an Australian warmer climate. And I think you mentioned something in your book, and why is that? Or is there a specific reasoning behind it?
Let me break that into two parts. Petrol aromas are a separate issue all by themselves. But I think that one of the properties of Riesling, and in fact it's being discussed in many places now, is that it has a very broad so-called climatic transect. It works in a whole different range of temperatures depending on where you are. You have the Clare Valley in Australia and West Australia, and it's like inland Mendocino. It's like Potter Valley in Mendocino. Not like the coastal Mendocino, but like the inland Mendocino. So that's pretty warm. On the other hand, you can also put it in Tasmania, which tends to be actually relatively cool. Certainly, everything that's up around the 50th north latitude, between 48 and 50 degrees north, has been relatively cool. And even today, it is relatively cool, but it just isn't as cool as it used to be, which is probably a good thing. We have a lot more good vintages now than we had before, and we have a lot more, good wines as a result. So I think that broad climatic transect, which Schultz and some of the climate scientists who've been working with him on grape varieties and climatic suitabilities have remarked, relatively unusual that you see a variety that is so adaptable to different climate bands. And that's going to be really, really important going forward. And it just comes to it naturally. It's just one of those things. And it's very much recognized by climate scientists. You would not get away with this with Pinot Noir. You would not get away with it. That is a real problem. If those areas get dramatically warmer, they will not be Pinot country anymore. And actually, Napa Valley is concerned even about Cabernet, and they're thinking maybe they're going to have to go to something that's even tougher than Cabernet in order to survive.
Well, you can start seeing in Bordeaux, they start getting some Portuguese grape varieties getting into the blend. That's for sure is the movement, this concern that is around wine and globally. And so, what about the petrol? Because that's for me is one of the traits of of Riesling is unique.
It's only in the last 20 years or so that we've been able to identify the organic compounds that are responsible for the petrol character in wines. Not exclusively Riesling, but it is true that it seems to occur more with Riesling than it does with most other aromatic varieties. And that we won't go into that. It's like 48 syllables long, but basically it's called TDN for short. And it is a norisoprenoid. It is not itself aromatic, but it is the liberator of aromas for this particular kind, which are usually described as petrol, kerosene, gasoline. Sometimes people say it overlaps with minerality. I think that's very confusing. I think minerality, we don't know exactly what that is either, but it's very different. It's a textural property, and this is not a textural property. This is an aromatic property. And I think it's, so since this was identified, and could therefore the quantitative load of TDN could be measured, there have been a number of studies done to try to determine what circumstances lead to more and what circumstances lead to less. A lot of that early work was done at Cornell University, and it was focused primarily on things like when during the growing cycle do you have to be careful about sun exposure, and when during the growing cycle do you want more sun exposure? That's not holding up terribly well to, it's looking like that maybe wasn't really a reliable indicator. But Geisenheim, again, which has been really a pioneer in all of these things, stumbled really onto something that turns out to be very interesting. And that's soil types. Two things that seem to contribute to that TDN production, and particularly to the early appearance in the life of the wine. Lots of people are perfectly happy to have TDN in a 10, 20-year-old wine, but they somehow or other think it amounts more to a flaw of some sort if it occurs too early. So what are these things? One is extreme soil malnutrition. If you have very poor soil, very low in nitrogen, you are more likely to get TDN than if you have a relatively richer, nitrogen-rich, well-nourished soil. That's one. The other one is really surprising, and it is the pH of the soil. That is the relative acidity and alkalinity of the soil. There is very low incidence of TDN and this smell of kerosene in grapes that have been grown on alkaline soils, in other words, limestone and its relatives. Put it on an acid soil, like most forms of shale and things of that sort, and you get a lot of acidity and you get a lot more TDN. And we may still learn some more things, but that's where we seem to be at the moment.
Okay, yeah, that's so interesting. I mean, obviously, when you start thinking about Riesling, and I've been thinking the whole time about Germany, and there was something you mentioned earlier about the warmer and better vintages all throughout, and I've been thinking about the law in Germany, the Qualitas wine would they still hold up? Because obviously they started as sort of like borderline riper to super ripe, but now then it's getting more consistent. Would that still
Well,
be?
let's put it this way. So the original purpose of the distinctions between Cabinet, Spätlese, Auslese had nothing to do with the amount of residual sugar after the wine was made. It had to do with the amount of sugar in the grape, a signal of maturity. So obviously, you had more maturity in the grape if you were picking later, assuming that other things are held constant. And so that made the Auslesen and the Spätlesen typically um, later picks, and that's what they mean. After all, Spätlese, that's what Spätlese means. I think that whole way of looking at wine on must wait was much more interesting when we were dealing with much colder weather, and with one other variable, which was very high yield. In Europe, when you're trying to get high yields off of grapes that are having difficulty ripening, must wait becomes a very interesting thing that you want to measure and you want to adapt to when you're making wine. That's not so true, I think, at this point, because it's never the case that we don't have enough must wait. And nobody who's trying to make quality wine is
Yeah.
is dependent upon high yields.
And I mean, for me, like when I was reading the history of in your book and the history of Riesling, how it changed from being quite dry and oxidized style and being super bright and fruity, what fruit driven that we have now. That was sort of the change for white wine. It was the how we produced wine before the per se Second World War, and really Riesling was the first white grape variety to change and become super bright and fruit and this beautiful fruit that we know now. How what was the style before and why did it change?
Well, let's see. So I think it's probably fair to say that from the High Middle Ages until the 16th, 17th century, the default style for white wines, Riesling and others, in the Rhine Rift Valley. So that's everything, from southern Alsace to the Low Countries, was 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 dry, normal alcohols, normal fermentation alcohols. It was made quickly. It was on the market very quickly, carried a premium price, is a relatively straightforward fermentation. You could not have this on the market, 6 weeks after harvest if you were doing anything else. You didn't have time. So that seems to have been the sort of default style that really persists. So while we were still safely in the realm of dry, simple, fresh wines, it turns out that a homegrown technique was created. It was called gefeuerte Wein, fired wine, or heat treated wine. And it's not at all what you think it is. It's got absolutely nothing to do. It's oxidized, and it has nothing to do with evaporation and then the addition of alcohol, of fermented alcohol, concentrated alcohol. to the wines. That happens in Western Europe, in west of Germany. It does not seem to happen in the Rhine-Rift Valley. But this was actually a very simple thing where people discovered that you can get a sweet wine that is stable if you heat the area around the fermentation casks, but in a room, quickly. That will kill the yeast, stop the ferment. Well, it will. It doesn't work the way you think it's going to. It actually, yes, the fermentation speeds up at first, but then it stops entirely because the yeast are no longer viable, and the rest of it is now a sweet wine.
Almost like pasteurization, almost like getting to. Okay, well, that's so fascinating. So fascinating. Yeah, of course, they had the market ready for it. I mean, John, we cover a lot of different area of Riesling, and I really enjoyed learning a bit about the history and the future as well, and seeing where this great variety is going. Obviously, in your book, I really enjoyed that it's cover every major region. There are maps on where the different area are, and there's all like second part of the book which you break down every single region and what each the major producer did for the grape variety, which is a remarkable job, and I don't think we could ever cover in half an hour, 40 minutes podcast. Is not the aim for it, but I really enjoyed learning more about this grape variety and see where it went and where it's going, definitely, and why is still so popular, because it shows in your book. I want to thank you for your time, and thank you for coming on the show. Thank you, John.
Thank you very much, Matteo. I appreciate it. It's been fun.
Thank you. And if you have anything else you might add, tell me.
One of the interesting things about Riesling is that over the last century, the amount of it on planet Earth has moved around, but the amount has actually remained relatively constant. We've been close to 50,000 hectares worldwide for a long time. It's moved around to different areas, and it moved late. Riesling seems not to have migrated very far from its homeland, which is either Western Germany or it's extreme Eastern France. We don't really know where that first vine grew. We frequently don't know where the first vine of old vines grew. But it doesn't seem to have moved very much. It was a very reluctant traveler until the 19th century. And the Austrians had made a minor effort to try to convince people that there was some evidence of Riesling in the Kremstal in the 18th century and the 17th century, but there really isn't much data to support that. It doesn't seem to be true. So it was a slow traveler to get moving. So while
but now you find it in many countries, and it is adored and from producers and around the globe, and you can see popping around more often. I really enjoy it. I found some from the south of Chile through Austria, wherever. So it's amazing, and I was the first sort of single varietal topical episode I did, which was very interesting. It was very different spotlight and a different view on wine. And thank you again for your time, John.
Well, thanks for doing this. I'm sure that the people who will listen to your podcast will be pleased with the result that you've produced for them. So thanks very much. Good to know you. And come visit sometime when you're in California.
Remember to hit the subscribe button and to tell your friends about the podcast. Today's guest was Dr. John Haeger, author of the book Riesling the Discover, Bold, Bright and Dry. Be sure to go to mattiascarpazza.com and to subscribe to the mailing list. It's the only way you can listen to the Presage, the after-interview conversation with the guest. You can find Looking Into Wine on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon Music and every major listening app. If you enjoy the podcast, you can donate on mattiascarpazza.com. Music produced by Samuele Di Nardo, editing and mastering by Tommaso Ascoli.